Hello, this is Taylor with your mad scientist and magical experimenter, and in my last video I talked about how I go about experimenting with magic, and I promised that I was going to basically do a series of videos, a series of case studies, if you will, about what I'm doing. So this is the first one, and this one is aptly focused on research. I don't feel that you can experiment until you've done your research. In this particular case, what we're dealing with, to kind of refresh your memory, is we have a spatial consecration prayer that uses 4 archangels and elemental powers associated with those archangels. And in the book Temple Magic by William G. Gray, I found that there were 3 additional archangels that were referenced in regards to space. I emailed R.J. Stewart, my mentor, and said to him, hey, I found this, and he said, you know, you don't really need that, but you don't really need to come up with 3 additional prayers, but if you want to, you can. That's your choice, and so I'm going to do it. That's part of my experiment. The prayers I'm going to come up with are actually going to be part of what I'm going to call a temporal consecration prayer. So we have the spatial consecration prayer, which is to the 4 elements and forms its own sphere, because you're not dealing with a 2D representation, you're dealing with a sphere that's created. But what I'm going to do is create a temporal sphere with these 3 archangels in relationship to past, present, and future. And I'm going to talk a little bit later in the video about why I've come up with those particular correspondences and how. Let's talk about the spatial consecration prayer first. Alright, it's to the 4 elements, it's to the 4 primary directions, east, south, west, north, right? So let's look at let's kind of do a little bit of analysis here. Now I want to note a couple things. First off, the correspondences in the spatial consecration prayer that I've learned are not the same as in the Temple Magic book, which, hey, just speaks to the reality that people personalize their correspondences to some degree. It also speaks to the fact that you may be working with different systems of magic. Now, R.J. Stewart was a student of Gray, William G. Gray, but that doesn't mean he wouldn't have come up with his own things. Obviously he has, and that's fine. That's what we want to note and acknowledge, is that there can be different systems or different results and findings. So while we're going to use the 3 archangels from this, we're not going to use the correspondences from this book. We're going to have to discover what those correspondences are. Now, okay. And you're saying, all right, that's great, but who are these archangels, Taylor? Already, tell us, please. I know Felix is practically screaming that right now, and I'm going to tell you, Felix. And everyone else. All right. So our archangel for the east is Raphael. And the east is going to represent the element of air, the color of white, the sword of truth, and the power of life. Okay? Now I'm going to recite the spatial consecration prayer for that direction. Come, air of east, come, purify this space and all within with your sacred breath. Bring with you the sword of truth, carried by the white-robed ones who mediate the spiritual powers of instruction and inspiration under the mantle of Archangel Raphael and the perpetual spiritual power of life. All right, there we go. Now we have south. South is Michael. It has the rod associated with it. It has the color red, fire, light. So here's the spatial consecration prayer for south. Come, fire of south, come. Purify this space and all within with your sacred flame. Bring with you the rod of uprightness carried by the red-robed ones who mediate the spiritual powers of illumination and initiation under the mantle of Archangel Michael. Okay, that's south. Now we have west. West is water. West is the Archangel Gabriel. It's life. It's blue. Okay, so those are, and it's the chalice. Those are our correspondences right there. So here's the spatial consecration prayer for that. Come, water of west, come. Purify this space and all within with your sacred rain. Bring with you the chalice of compassion carried by the blue-robed ones who mediate the spiritual powers of donation and reception under the mantle of Archangel Gabriel and the perpetual spiritual power of life. All right, there we go. Now we get to the north, right? North, we have the color black, we have soil, we have the pentacle of prudence, we have the archangel Ariel, and we have law. So those are the correspondences. So let me recite it. The spatial consecration prayer. Come, come, earth and north, come. Purify this space and all within with your sacred soil. Bring with you the pentacle of prudence carried by the black-robed ones, who mediate the spiritual powers of destruction and regeneration under the mantle of Archangel Ariel and the perpetual spiritual power of law. And I want to note also that we're dealing with certain spiritual powers that are associated. So we have, like with the north, we have destruction and regeneration. We have with the west, we have donation and reception. Illumination and initiation with the south, and inspiration and instruction with the east. So, that's our spatial consecration prayer. Okay? Now that we've come up with the spatial consecration prayer, or we already have it, we already have that basis. We have that. And hey, and if we wanted to stop right there for the purposes of forming a protective sphere that will allow us to do magical work, great. But I think it's interesting to include the temporal consecration. So I haven't come up with the prayers yet. I haven't done any of the other work. And the reason why is because I wanted to show the research process. But let's look at the research process now. So I'm going to look in Temple Magic. And in Temple Magic, Grace says that the other archangels are Metatron, Savuvial, and Sandaphalon. And he has a couple of other, he has crown, star, and cube associated with them. Future, present, and past associated with them as far as correspondences. Colors are ultraviolet, visible, and infrared. Oh, and directions, up, center, and down. So fascinating, okay? So, and we're also dealing with above, under, we're dealing with the overworld, the underworld, and then Midgard, or the present, or our world as well with that. Now, most of you are probably going to be familiar with Metatron and Sandaphalon if you've done Kabbalistic studies. But you probably haven't heard of Savuvial. I had not heard of Savuvial. I did a Google search for Savuvial. Couldn't find him anywhere. The only place I could find him was in another William G. Gray book. Kabbalistic Concepts. Now, we could say, well, what does this mean, Taylor? Does this mean Gray made him up? I don't know. I don't think he made him up. He's not the kind of person that I think would do that. I just think that the information about this particular archangel isn't out there. But Metatron and Sandaphalon, we do know a fair amount about. So with Sandaphalon, it makes sense that he would be associated with the underworld, because Kabbalistically he's associated with Malkuth. And really Malkuth is, if nothing else, the entrance to the underworld. And in some ways, it's manifested reality, but it's also the earth. It's touching the underworld. So Sandaphalon makes sense as far as that goes, and he also makes sense in terms of the concept of the past, because he's going to represent the past energies. Metatron is the archangel associated with Kether Kabbalistically. And he's also known as the face of God, but ironically enough, you can't see Metatron, right? Because he's so bright. And he represents the future, and also the cosmic, the overworld. Well, and that makes sense, because if he's Kabbalistically associated with Kether, he's going to be the archangel that is representative of that particular power. So again, it makes sense. So what about Savuvial? What do we do in regards to Savuvial? Because Savuvial is again not, we only find him in two places. We find him in Temple Magic, and we find him in Kabbalistic Concepts. And honestly, he's not given a huge amount of mention in either one. So this is tough. Well, here's what I did. I did an invocation of Savuvial. I didn't have a sigil or anything like that. I got into a meditative state, and I mentally whispered his name, and then I started to call it louder and louder and louder, and lo and behold, I got a hold of him. The color I got from him was gray, which is interesting because the color that, in terms of the principle, he's associated with the neutral principle. So gray and neutral seems to work out pretty well. In the sense that I got from him was very much that he is the present. It was just kind of a feeling of a blip. He's here in this moment. That's what the present is. Present is that the experience in the moment. And of course, the present is always turning into both the past and the future. So that makes sense then. And I could see how Savuvio really could be grounded in the perspective, the experience of, you know, the middle world, right? So we have Metatron above, we have Sandophyllon below, we have Savuvio, even in some ways within, because Savuvio is really our experience of the present, right? It's our experience in the moment. You're watching this video right now, and guess what? Savuvio's there with you. Savuvio is always present in the present. You may not be aware of it, but Savuvio is there. Now, of course, you don't have to buy into that, but that's just my take from it. So we have some beginning principles here in terms of a correspondence that we can work with. So if we're going to do an experiment from here, what we have to do is, we've done our research, now we have to figure out next steps. So I'll tell you briefly what my next steps are going to be, because we're going to actually I'll be walking you through them in more depth next week. My next step is going to be doing an invocation to all 7 of the archangels, actually. I want to see if I can get more information from the 4 in the spatial consecration prayer, and also see if they'd be willing to allow me to do a painting and offering to them. And then I'm going to work with the other 3 as well and see if they're willing to do the same. We'll do the invocation, get some more information, and then from there, we'll see what happens next. So I will report on that next week and and tell you what I've done and what's worked or hasn't worked, and then we'll go from there with our experiment. If you have comments, feel free to leave them below, and click on the T in order to subscribe.